In our earlier classes, we have discussed regarding supply chain and different aspects of supply chain management. We have seen two of the case studies. Then we also discussed regarding the meaning of supply chain. We spoke regarding the concepts, that is flow of information, product, materials. Then we discussed regarding generalized supply chain model. We spoke regarding the objectives, the activities, and the stages of supply chain management. And we also spoke regarding the success of supply chain management, yeah, from the way of product, the flow of information, and also flow of funds. And in our today's session, we shall try to speak or try to understand how there can be effectiveness in supply chain management. Now, one thing that we should always remember is that the main aspect of supply chain is that now both the effectiveness and the value of the supply chain is all it always comes from excuse me, it always comes from the ability of the supply chain management or the supply chain to cooperate, coordinate, and align with the partners, those who are present in the chain. Now, these partners, they could be service providers, they can be employees, the suppliers, or it can also even be distributors. Now, every partner who is present in the supply chain, they are supposed to work with utmost motivation and also with utmost, care and determination. That is when there can be success in the supply chain. Now, the process of the supply chain should be such that it should be able to process and have a common business goal. So it includes, the business activity analysis, which should allow to optimize the process of supply chain. Now, both strategic operations and operational one. So, supply chain effectiveness is most of the times determined by, some identified management traits. Such traits which would put these supply chains at an upper hand, or which would be able to differentiate it from other supply chains. Now, you might have already learned as to what trait is all about. So, some of the traits that are necessary for an effective supply chain is, first one, let us speak of the strategy. So, now effectiveness always begins with this strategy. Now, if we observe close enough, all those organizations, all those industries which have best supply chains, they have a corporate strategy which which is able to drive planning, all the tactical designs, the milestones, the objectives, the plans, the vision, the mission, and other steps in the strategy development, and they know how to implement them. And if at all any problem arises, they would also know how to tackle all these problems. So, the chain organization is something which is built on and around all this fact. So, the supply chain strategy should be such that it should always allow the industries to plan its tactical operations and thereby prioritize among suppliers, customers, and the products. Now, having said this, now strategy is something which is able to set platform for supply chain execution. Now, if the supply chain members they are able to understand the process, which crosses their company, and they are able to extend it beyond the company, then for such things the strategy has to be built about the flow of products and information. Now, this flow of product and information, it stretches from supplier and through to store shelves or even to the customer warehouse. Now, if the company strategy, it means a significant shift in markets or products or customers, then the supply chain must change. Now, speaking about strategy and the time horizon. Now, strategy is always long term and it will always have focus towards the growth of the organization. Now, the strategy should also be dynamic in nature. What is dynamic in nature? It should be able to fit according to the changes that is happening in the business environment. And also, it must take into account the resistance to change that can happen with the companies. Now, what is resistance to change? Resistance to change is nothing but not being able to change according to the changing circumstances. Now, never a company or a company strategy should be such that it is not flexible enough. It should be flexible enough so that it can be such that it can adapt to the changes, but it should not be loose either. Now, it is also very well said that strategy should be such that it should foster changes in the organization, or it should act as a facilitator of the changes or something which result in changing the strategy for better. And it should also be agile and should be able to recognize or incorporate and even adopt to elements towards the change that is necessary. One thing that you should always remember with supply chain is that there is never such a thing where we can tell as one or we can put a number as one supply chain management approach. It can never be the same for all the companies or for even for the different supply chains in the same organization. Now, the process of supply chain shall definitely be unique for each supply chain that exists, and there can be not even one size supply chain which can fit to all the supply chain that is existing. So these are some of the things how a strategy, when it is having all these traits, it would lead for a better supply chain in the organization. Now the next one is with regarding to the metrics. What are metrics? Metrics speaks about results. Now these results always matter. Okay, but then speaking about metrics, you should know that the right measures always matter more. Now, when there is right measure, that's when results can be more specifically reached. Now, performance management. If you know what performance management is, it often gets lost in the the mess of supply chain initiatives. Now there are many initiatives the different industries firms are taking when it comes to supply chain management, like radio frequency identification or RFID, or what we call as Six Sigma quality, or lean manufacturing. We have outsourcing, we have notes vendor management, or we have collaborative planning, forecasting and replenishment. We have spend management and regulatory compliances. All these things are a different way of managing things in the organization. Now, all this initiative, in the base, what they do is they promise to improve the speed of transaction or the process, or they speak about optimizing through taking minimum risk, or they speak about maximizing the return and minimizing the risk. But then the effectiveness of all this initiative should also be evaluated because they relate to the overall performance goals. Now, financial measures are poor ways to evaluate. Now, direct and managed supply chain, you can not always have financial measurement as the one stick wherein you can measure things. So the key performance indicators are could be orders. Now, if it is like delivery complete, then maybe time and accuracy, or lead times, or reliability, inventory levels, or potential out of stock conditions, and logistics stocks. So, if you have to evaluate supply chain, maybe we can use all these. Maybe we can, use all this. On the basis of financial measure, you can measure it on the basis of, as we discussed, maybe Six Sigma quality, or collaborative planning, forecasting and replenishment. On these things, when we measure, we'll know better metrics. uh, the next one is technology. Now, technology is something which can be called as the enabler of the process. Now, there are business organizations or corporations which invest, millions and trillions of money over the past 2 decades in the supply chain management software and systems. Now, if we observe the history of it, however, their focus has always been on improving the transaction processing or the streamlining processing, and also optimizing throughput, in short, on improving the efficiency of the organization. There are only few firms, if we have to point out in specific, which have applied their resources actually to supply chain effectiveness and to the ability to plan strategically, and also try to find expectations before they can become expensive problems for the organization. And if we agree or not, this technology is very much important for supply chains execution, so that they can provide event management or exception management. Now if you see the supply chain, now complete supply chain visibility, right from purchase order to delivery orders, it is technology, and only technology which can be a collaborator in this process and make supply chain more effective. Now the next trait is regarding the performance of the supplier. Now this is in a way telling that the successfulness of the supply chain, most of the time it depends upon the performance of the supplier in the chain. Now that is because the way in which the supplier acts in the supply chain, now if he acts in the right manner, then every other activity in the supply chain would go in the right manner. But if he lacks in doing his activities or his side of work, then it might result in creating havoc on the revenue on the entire chain. Even the it can disturb the inventory management and also the profitability of the organizations. That is where it becomes necessary that companies should be able to control the suppliers and also their supply chains, and they should try to gain insight into operational issues through interactions by identifying if at all there are any kind of root causes. So all such things should be analyzed, and they should try to understand the impact or results of the various actions that the organization does. Now all this you know all these activities, now it is critical to align performance with demand planning. Now they should not let suppliers control their business, as it will always lead to much variability in the performance. Now suppliers should be partners in the supply chain. That is when effectiveness can be brought into the supply chain. If at all suppliers becomes like dictators, that is when the organization will have problem with the supply chain that they are having. The next one is with regard to collaboration and integration. See, it is integration and collaboration. Okay. Now, integration is what? Integration is combining or coming together. Now, this particular point tells that this process of supply chain, for it is always necessary that integration is throughout the chain, not only in the organization, but it should be beyond, and it should be there with the suppliers and customers also. And even operation, if we see, even operation managers, they often make decisions about demand or the supply, maybe with regard to manufacturing, fulfillment and distribution. There are a lot of times that these operation managers, they try to make decision without clearly understanding the effect of these decisions on performance targets. So this may sometimes result in what we can call as blind spots or what we can call as gaps in the supply chain that can sometimes significantly brings down the results or the effectiveness of the organization. Now, to solve all these problems, collaborating with the key supply chain participant is the one thing which is important, so that additional focus and the resource can be allocated to total supply chain. And one more trait is risk mitigation. Now, risk mitigation is something, an effort that we put so that the risk is reduced and the effectiveness is made better, or the results are made better. Now, how can we mitigate this risk? Now, a lot of time we have discussed a point called as critical areas, or those areas which should be prioritized in the beginning. Now, when it comes to supply chain, critical areas include things like suppliers, especially the logistics service providers, or maybe the ports if at all it is included in the supply chain, and few other potential risks that, if not worked properly, might disrupt the company's supply chain. So, all these factors which are critical for supply chain effectiveness, they have to be given a well thought. They are to be analyzed time and again on a continuous basis. So the supply chain, in the ultimate analysis, it has to give agility and responsiveness to better adjust to changing marketing conditions, and to some degree it should also be able to control those forces that are existing. So that is some of the points regarding how effectiveness can be brought into supply chain. Now, speaking about supply chain management, let us see the next one. That is the decision phases in a supply chain management. Now, what is this decision phases? Or why are we speaking decision in supply chain management? What is it all about? Now, one more element of supply chain is that, for the success of this supply chain, definitely it requires decisions relating to, the flow of information, the flow of product or service, or the flow of funds. Now, each decision should be made so that there is some betterment, or there is a raise in the supply chain surplus or the supply chain revenue. Now, speaking about these different decisions that would be there in the supply chain, these decisions, they fall into three categories, or three phases we can tell. Now, how has these decisions been divided? Now, these decisions, they have been divided on the basis of frequency of each decision that has to be made, and also on the basis of the time that is necessary, or the time frame during which each decision phase would have an impact on the organization. And on this basis, this categorization has been made. So the three different phases are supply chain strategy or supply chain design, what we can. The second one is supply chain planning, and the third one is supply chain operation. So now the first one is supply chain strategy or the supply chain decision. So during this phase or during this stage, now what are the decisions that are to be taken? Now in this first phase, given the marketing and also the pricing plans for a product or a service that the company is offering, that particular firm it decide how the structure of the supply chain would be in the coming years, and it also decides how the configuration of the chain would be. That is to tell, how shall the different resources be allocated and what process shall be performed by each of the stage. Okay. Now this supply chain strategy basically it also involves decisions to be made with regards to whether a product or the service that the company is coming up. Is it that all the aspects shall be produced within the organization, or is it that it is going for outsourcing, or you know when we tell within the organization, it means it is in-house production. So whether it is outsourcing it or the things would be in-house production. It also speaks about the location of the plants. It speaks about the capacities of production, the capacity of warehousing facilities, whether it is necessary that cold storage is there, or how should be the storage, what is the time that has to be stored, and is it that all the products are located in one place, or is it that the product shall be produced in the different locations? When it comes to transportation, how shall be the goods transported? That is to tell the modes of transported. Will it be distributed through railways, roadways, or waterways? And also the type of information system that has to be used. Now all these things shall be discussed in the first, the supply chain strategy phase or supply chain design phase. Now our organization must see that the supply chain configuration supports its strategic objectives and also increase the surplus during this phase. Now, if we take a company, maybe Cisco company, we take. Now, whenever this company decides regarding, the sources for manufacturing its components, when it takes decision regarding contract manufacturers for manufacturing, when it decides things for the location and capacity of its warehouse, all these are supply chain decision or what we can call as strategic decisions. So, supply chain design decisions are typically made for long term, okay, for more than 5 to 6 years minimum. And these decisions that are done, they are expensive to alter on a short notice, And consequently, when companies make these decisions, they must take into account some of the uncertainty in the anticipated market conditions for the coming years that they are actually planning. The next phase is supply chain planning. Now, what happens under supply chain planning? Now, we said that each phase has been divided on the basis of the time horizon that is considered within each phase. Now, for any decision that is made during the supply chain planning, the time frame that is considered shall be within quarter to a year. Therefore, the supply chain's configuration determined in strategic phase is fixed. So, these kind of configuration, it establishes constraints within which the planning must be done. Now, to give an example to constraint, what can normally be constraint? Now, all this, bringing in resources or distributing, all these things, it will have its own limitation. Now, one main limitation that the organization will always face is financial restrictions. So maybe you can have a better kind of distribution, but because there is constraint on how much amount you can spend, maybe you would be forced to choose such a distribution facility which would come within your range of expenditure. So that is one of the constraint. So the goal of planning will always be to maximize the surplus, supply chain surplus, which would be able to generate it over the planning horizon and given the constraints established during the strategic or design phase. Now, normally these companies they start to they start this planning phase with a forecast for the coming year or a time frame which can normally be compared of demand in different markets. So, planning always includes making decisions regarding which markets will be supplied from which locations, the subcontracting of manufacturing, the inventory policies that are to be followed, and also the time and size of marketing and the price promotions. Now, let us take the example of Dell. Or Dell is a company which is into producing computer services. Now, if at all the company makes decision regarding the market supplied by a product facility and target production quantities at each locations are classified as planning decisions. Now, planning establishes parameters within which a supply chain will function over a specified period of time. Now, in the planning phase, companies must include uncertainty in demand, exchange rates, and also competition over this time horizon in their decision. Now, given a shorter time frame and better forecast than designing phase, companies in the planning phase they try to incorporate any kind of flexibility built into the supply chain in the design phase and thereby try to exploit it to optimize performance. And as a result of planning phase, the companies they try to define a set of operating policies that can normally govern the short term operations of the company. Now, coming to the last one, that is supply chain operation. Now, first we were planning for a long time frame for minimum of 5 to 6 years. Then we spoke about the second phase, that is supply chain planning. Here decisions shall be taken for quarterly or to the max on the yearly basis. Now when we speak about supply chain operation, here the time horizon would normally be for on the basis of a week or on a daily basis. Now, it is during this phase the company makes decisions with regarding to that of individual customer orders. Now, at the operational level, supply chain it tries to configure it, you know, is here all the configuration shall be considered fixed and planning policies would have already been defined. Now, the goal of supply chain operation is to handle incoming customer orders in the best possible manner. And during this phase, that is when the firms allocate inventory or production to individual orders. Now, it tries to set a date that an orders or one particular order shall be fulfilled. Normally, what happens is that it tries to generate pick lists at a warehouse. After that, allocate an order to a particular shipping mode, or and it does the shipment. After that, it sets delivery schedules of trucks if it is going through trucks, and later on, it places replenishment orders. Now, because operational decisions are being made in the short term, yeah, it can also be on the basis of minutes or hours or days. Now there is less uncertainty about the demand information. Now, given the constraints established by the configuration and planning policies, the goal during the operational phase is to exploit the reduction of uncertainty and also to optimize performance. That is why, the design, planning, and operations of supply chain it has a strong impact on overall profitability and success. So, it is fair to state that a large part of success of firms like maybe Walmart and Dell it can be attributed always for their effective supply chain designing, planning, and also how the supply chain operates, which are concerned with these firms' ability to you know maintain the chains effectively. Yes, that is the aspects that had to be covered under the different decision phases in a supply chain. Now, these different supply chain they were divided or categorized on the basis of the time frame during the decisions are to be made. The first one here the decisions that would be normally be made would be for a long time horizon which includes maybe time frame from 5 to 6 years or beyond that. The time horizon that is included under supply chain planning would be normally ranges from quarterly basis to yearly basis. Whereas supply chain operation, here the time frame that is included would normally be from it can be on the weekly basis, monthly basis, daily basis. Now the supply chains are so effective that things are being done on hourly basis of minute also. So I hope whatever we discussed up until this point. Oh, welcome back to this session, students. Now we shall see one of the last topics of this chapter, that is process view of a supply chain. Now, to speak about process view, what do we mean by this process? The process is something which happens every time in the same sequential way. So that we can regard as a process. Now, speaking about the process view of supply chain, here we normally have two views. That is, one is cyclic view of supply chain management, and the second one is we have push view or pull view. Now, uh, to be specific, it is three different types, that is cyclic view you have, push view you have, and pull view you have. Now, if we observe the supply chain, we have mentioned it in a line diagram. In the beginning, we sourced the place from where the raw materials could be procured. Then came the supplier. Then we had the manufacturer. We had warehousing, distribution, and ultimate consumer. We had drawn it in a line. Now, if you think in terms of practicality, now it is a cycle, process which happens once after the customer has received the goods. It starts with the procuring raw materials. So it is a sequence of process which takes place within and also between different stages, and which is combined to fill a customer's need for either a product or a service. Now, when we speak about this supply chain process, there are two different ways to view the performance performed in a supply chain. The first one is cyclic view, the next one is push or pull view of supply chain. Okay, now try to understand this in a very, very simple way. Okay, now it is very simple. Now, see what happens in cyclic view is the process in a supply chain are divided into a series of cycles. Okay. Now each of the cycle is performed at the interface between two successive stages of the supply chain, or the two successive partners of the supply chain. And we have push or pull view. Now here what happens, the process in a supply chain, it is divided into categories, okay, depending on whether they are executed in response to a customer order or in anticipation of customer's order. Now this pull process, they are initiated by customer order, whereas push process, they are initiated and performed in anticipation of customer's order. Okay, it is a lot to think. Now take the first one, okay, cyclic wave. Here, okay, now before that, we discussed there are two types. One is cyclic view of supply chain management, the other one is push or pull view of supply chain management. Now I'll tell what happens in cyclic view. Here, what happens is that we have the partners in the supply chain. Now, between two partners, there is one type of cycle which happens every time. Now, this view of seeing supply chain is called a cyclic view of supply chain management. That is in terms of how the orders are being cycled every time. Okay. Next one is push or pull view. Now, when we speak about the push or pull view, here we are trying to speak in terms of the execution of order or how the things are being manufactured. Okay. Now, you might have seen different companies. Now, there are companies which produce goods even before they get the order. Now, all such supply chain, it is called as push process, and whenever the order is executed, once after getting orders from the customer, it is called as pull process. So this is all about cyclic wave, push or pull process. So the first one we shall see, that is cyclic wave. What we said, that it is performed at the interface between two successive stages. Now see in the slide that has been put up. Now what are the stages that has been given here? Now there are five different stages that has been given. That is customer, you have retailer, you have distributor, you have manufacturer, and you have supplier. So five different stages you have, and you have four different interfaces given here. So when there is some kind of transaction between customer and retailer, there you have one of the interface, that is called as customer order cycle, or in other words, now anything that happens in customer order cycle, it happens between the customer and the retailer. The next one we have is replenishment cycle. So here what we can tell is every transaction that happens here happens between the retailer and the distributor. Now the next one we can see in the slide is manufacturing cycle. So every transaction that happens in the manufacturing cycle happens between distributor and manufacturer. And the last one that has been shown in the diagram is procurement cycle. So all the transaction that happens between manufacturer and supplier comes within the procurement cycle. Now why the name cycle? Because these processes does not comes to an end after one transaction. It would be happening in cycle. One finishes, the other begins, and it shall be executed. Once the second one finishes, the third starts. So each cycle, they occur at the interface between two successive stages of the supply chain. So the five stages thus result in four different process cycles. Now, you have definitely understood what it is. But what you have to remember is that not every cycle is necessary to have four cycles, clearly separated. Now there can be supplier, manufacturer, directly customer. So there might, then what happens? In that stage, manufacturing cycle and replenishment cycle shall be integrated together. So, never consider that every supply chain that we consider will have these four different cycles. Depending upon the stages of the cycles that are there in the supply chain, the processes will also differ. That is to tell, a grocery supply chain in which a retailer stocks finished good inventories and places replenishment orders with the distributors is likely to have all the four cycles that are being showed in the PPT. But let us take one more example of this Dell company. Now, this company it sells directly to the customer. So, in contrast to the former example that we given, here it sells directly to customer and thereby it bypasses both the retailer and distributor. So that is what we were discussing, that there is no necessary that for every supply chain there shall be all the four different cycles separately and clearly explained or clearly visible. Now, what you can see on the left side of your slide is it is regarding the sub processes in each supply chain process cycle. That is to tell there are four different cycles and for every cycle these six different process shall be present. Now, if we clearly observe, for every cycle there is a supplier, then there is a buyer. Now we distinguish between the first one as a supplier and the end partner as a consumer. But in reality, in every cycle, the one who sells is the supplier, the one who buys is the buyer. So each cycle starts with the supplier marketing the product to the customer. Okay? Once after the buyer sees all this product or the service, then the buyer places an order which is received by the supplier. Once after receiving the order, the supplier, if it is possible from his side, then he supplies the order. Now, once he supplies the order, the product or the service, it shall be received by the buyer. Okay, this is how it happens. But then there are also chances that sometimes the one who buys, he or she may return some of the product or other recycled materials to the supplier, or it can be passed to a third parties also. So the cycle of activities would begin overall once again. So what are the six different sub processes that we saw? First one is supplier stage market product. That is the supplier markets the product that is in the hand for the for selling it. Now, the second sub process is buyer stage place order. That is nothing but depending on what is necessary, the one who intends to buy, he places the order. So once the place order, the sub process is nothing but with what is called as supplier stage receives order. That is to tell when I place order for my supplier, it is nothing but he receives the order. So once after my supplier receives the order, the next sub process would be that supplier stage supplies order. That is based on the request that he has got or based on the order that he has received, the supplier would be supplying the product or the services. Then comes the next stage that is called as buyer stage receives supply. That is nothing but when I ship the products or when I render the service, then the buyer is receiving the product or receiving the supply. That is the fifth stage, that is buyer stage, receiver, supply. So this is what happens. Or there are sometimes also chances that what product has been received, it might be returned or it might be sent to a third party. That is that makes up the sixth sub process, that is buyer returns receive reverse flow to supplier or to a third party. Now when that happens, the entire process shall begin from the first. So now depending on the transaction, depending upon each transaction, the sub processes can be applied to the appropriate cycle. Let us take a customer who is shopping online in Amazon. Okay. Now, this customer who is shopping online, they are part of customer order cycle. Now, with the customer as the buyer and the Amazon as the supplier. Now, in contrast to this example, or as opposite to that of this example, now when Amazon it orders book from a distributor to restock its inventory, now it is a part of replenishment cycle. Okay, now restock we do not tell, we call it as replenishment. Okay, so whenever Amazon it orders book from distributor to replenish its inventory, it is the part of replenishment cycle with Amazon or in Amazon. Here what happens? Here Amazon is the buyer and the distributor is the supplier. Now that is what I said earlier. Yes, when it comes to drawing a supply chain model, there is supplier who is the first who we call might be named as the first person in the chain, and there is the customer who would be coming at the end of the chain. But normally every stage one would be the buyer, the other would be the seller. So as same in this example, when if I am the person who is ordering something from Amazon, I am the buyer, Amazon is the seller or Amazon is the supplier. Now maybe I have ordered book itself. Now the same book, if the stock is finished, now when Amazon gives the order to the distributor so that it can replenish its stock, during that phase Amazon becomes the receiver or the buyer and the distributor becomes the supplier or seller. So if you clearly observe, within each cycle the goal of the buyer is always to ensure product availability and also to achieve economies of scale in ordering. When it comes to the supplier, with each cycle, what does the supplier does? He attempts to forecast customer orders and also he tries to reduce the cost of receiving the order. And the supplier, he then works to fulfill order on time. And also he try to improve efficiency, and also they try to improve the accuracy of the order fulfillment process. And in this process, as a buyer, the buyer also works to reduce the cost of receiving process. And speaking regarding the reverse flows, now they are managed so as to reduce cost and also meet any kind of environmental objectives. Okay. Now, as we discussed, what is the one point that we said? That each cycle has the basic sub process. Okay. But then one thing that is noteworthy is there are few important difference between cycles. So what are these differences? Now we said there are four different cycles. Each of the cycle, one is the supplier, one is the receiver, and these different sub processes happen in all the cycles. And we also said that it is not necessary that for one particular supply chain all the cycles are present. Somewhere the distinction may not be possible. And now we are discussing that yes, the sub processes might be same, but still there exists difference among those. So, for that matter, take into consideration customer order cycle. What happens here? Now, for customer order cycle, demand is external to the supply chain. Yes, you never know the customer is going to place the order or not. So when it comes to customer order cycle, here the demand is external to supply chain, and because of it being external element, it is always uncertain in nature. But except for customer order cycle, in all other cycle, order placement is uncertain, but it can be projected based on policies followed by the particular supply chain stage. Okay, I'll repeat it once again. Except for customer order cycle, for all other cycle, definitely the demand or the order placement is uncertain, but there are ways how it can be projected based on the policies policies which is followed by particular supply chain stage. Now let us make it still more simple with the help of example. So take into consideration the procurement cycle. Okay, what happens? Now if we consider a tire supplier to an automotive manufacturer company. Okay, now the supplier has the work of supplying tire for the manufacturing company. Now the supplier, he can predict the tire demand precisely once the production schedule at the manufacturer is known. Okay, but whereas when it comes to customer order cycle, it can the demand is external, it can be never known. But in other cycle, order placement or what we call as demand is uncertain, but if we know the policies of the other and through time and experience, it can be projected to some extent. So that is the first difference. The second difference across the cycles, it speaks to the scale of order. What is the scale of order? What do you think? How or what is your opinion with regards to this scale of order? Scale of order, in simple word, what it is? The quantity or the number of the product that is included. So what happens? When it is customer, what is the order? With the customer, normally, okay, take a customer who wants to buy a car. How much would be the order? So customer normally buys a single car. But then when customer orders, he orders one car. But whereas, you know, when the dealer's orders have to be made, they would order multiple car at the same time from the manufacturer. And whereas to manufacturer, in turn he orders an even larger quantity of tires from the supplier. So when we observe this cyclic view of supply chain, as we move from the customer to the supplier, the number of individual order declines and the size of each order increases. And thereby sharing of information and operating policies across supply chain stages becomes more important as we move further from the customer. So, this cyclic way of supply chain management, I hope it is very easy. What are the things that we saw? We saw that there are five different stages normally. That is customer, retailer, distributor, manufacturer, and supplier. And for every two stages there is one cycle that is happening, and we have customer order cycle, replenishment cycle, manufacturing cycle, and procurement cycle. The next point that we saw was there is no necessary that all these stages shall be present for every supply chain. Now depending upon how the partners are of the supply chain is, there can be chances that clear distinction between all these four stages might not be possible. And in making it understand, we give two examples. One where customer comes and orders in a retail shop. For such a supply chain, all the four stages, four cycles would be there, all the five stages would be there. In contrast to this, we took the example of Dell company, where the order is received directly from the customer. So what happens in such a cycle? In such a cycle, both the retailer and distributor is bypassed. So there cannot be a clear distinction of the four different stages. Then we spoke about the sub processes, and we said that for each of the cycle there are six different sub processes which happens same for each of the cycle, because now in each cycle one would be the supplier, the other would be the buyer. And we also said this point that yes, the processes would be same for each stage, but there are also some of the differences. And the two main differences that we saw is that first one with regarding to the demand. Okay, we said that when it comes to customer order cycle, the demand is unknown. So we cannot predict in exactly how much the demand would be. But whereas for all other cycle, the order placement shall be known by the policies of the other. That is the first distinction. The second distinction is with regard to number of order that is made or the scale of operation. With every stage that is being succeeding, the scale of the order increases. Now I have to buy one car, I'll order one car. Whereas retailer, instead of ordering one, he might order two of the cars with the distributor. Now the distributor might order 5 cars with the manufacturer. Now whereas manufacturer, he'll have to order raw materials from the supplier. Now instead of ordering the quantity of, you know, quantity that is necessary to manufacture 5 cars, the manufacturer might order the quantity of raw materials that is necessary to buy 10 of the cars. That is where we tell with the each successive stage, the scale of the order increases. Now, why do we have to understand this cyclic view of supply chain management? Or why is it necessary we understand it? Or where can we use it? Now, this cyclic view of supply chain, it becomes very helpful whenever we have to make a decision on the operations of the organization, because it can clearly tell the role that is being played by each of the partner or each of the member in the supply chain. Now, the detailed process description of a supply chain in the cyclic view would force a supply chain designer to consider the infrastructure required to support all these processes. So the cyclic view is helpful. To give an example, maybe when setting up information system to support the supply chain operations maybe. Now, what you have to remember is that a cyclic view of supply chain, it clearly defines the process that is involved and also the owners of each of the process. Now this view is very useful when considering the operational decisions. Okay, because it specifies the roles and responsibilities of each member of the supply chain and also the desired outcomes of each of the process. So this is all about cyclic view of supply chain. Now this is very easy to understand and also example. You have a lot of scope where you can give your own example and you can speak about the different things that is there in this particular cyclic view of supply chain management. So we shall say the next one. The next one is push view or pull view of supply chain management. Now, yet again, this is very, very simple in the principle that it has to speak of. Now, if I have to tell in a very simple words, this process is considered on the basis of how the demand is created or how there is a decision made on basis of what has to be produced. Now what we said, there are two, that is push view and pull view. So now what is the ideology behind this push view or pull view, or what is that it considers? Okay. Now this particular supply chain or this particular view of supply chain, it tells that all the processes that are included in a supply chain, it falls into one of the two categories. Okay. Now, how does it falls to these two categories? The question. Now, depending upon the timing of the execution as compared to the customer demand, from the end customer, all these processes falls either to push view or to the pull view. So what is it actually? Now in pull process, what happens is that the execution of a order, it is initiated in response to a customer order. With push process, the execution is initiated in anticipation of customer order. What does that mean now? Now, execution of order, what is it? It means I as a supplier, I have received an order from my customer or buyer regarding the what my buyer wants. Okay. Now, this act of receiving demand, they have divided into two, push and pull. Now there are different range of products, and now some products shall be produced, once after the order has been received. Maybe something like, as we give the example of Dell company. Now, if I get the order from my customer or my buyer, that is the time when I'll start with the supply process, or that is the time when I initiate the supply process. Or there are also this chance that the second wave, that is push wave. Here it is the you know execution process, it is anticipated from the customer order. Therefore, at the time of execution of a pull process, customer demand shall be known with clarity. Why? Because once after I received the order, that is when I began with supplying. So I know in exact terms this, customer demand. Whereas in contrast to that, push process, demand is not known, and this demand should always be forecasted. Now, if we have to tell about pull process, it can be referred to as a reactive process. That is, once the action is done, you react to that because they react on the customer demand. Whereas pull process, it is referred to as speculative process because the response or the demand is to speculate or forecasted then actually what the demand might be. Now, in this demand chain, we have something called as push-pull boundary. You can observe in your slide, if you see carefully, there is something called as push or pull boundary. Okay, now this push or pull boundary, it separates push process from that of pull process. Now, push process, it operates in an uncertain environment. Why? Because what happens under push process? The demand is unknown, but it is speculated, forecasted, and it is done. So, push process operates in uncertain demand because customer demand is not yet known. Whereas pull process, it operates in an environment in which customer demand is known. They are, however, often, constrained by inventory and capacity decision that were made in push phase. Now, what you can see is the normal push and pull wave. Now, Process 1, process 2, process 3, it speaks of push process. Then you have process K plus 1, process N minus 1, process N. Now do not go to give meaning for all those things, okay. Uh, just know that now with the example that we are going to see furthermore, you will understand what this is all about, okay. Now let us take into the push or pull view of LL Bean. Now this should help you in understanding the push and pull view in a better way. Okay. Now let us compare the make to stock environment, okay, which is there in LL Bean, and build to order, okay, environment like that of Dell. Okay, let us compare these two companies, that is LL Bean and Dell. Now what happens in LL Bean? Now LL Bean, it executes all the process in the customer order cycle after the customer arrives. Now all the process that are part of the customer order cycle are therefore pull process. Now all the order fulfillment, it takes place from product that is there in the inventory, that is built upon the anticipation of customer order. So the goal of replenishment cycle will always be to ensure product availability when a customer order arrives. Now all the process that is there in the replenishment cycle are performed in anticipation of demand, and that's why these are push process. Now the same thing holds true for process in the manufacturing and procurement cycle. Now in fact, if we speak about this in practical basis, especially raw materials such as fabric, it is often purchased 6 to 9 months before customer demand, and is expect customer demand is expected. So manufacturing itself begins 3 to 6 months before the point of sale. So the process in the LL Bean supply chain breaks up into pull and push. You can see in the diagram that is displayed in the left hand side of your PPT. Now see what has happened. There are four different stages, that is customer, the LL Bean, the manufacturer and supplier. Therefore we have three different cycle, wherein which the replenishment cycle and the manufacture cycle, it has been made together in the second stage. Yes. Now, what is this push and pull process and customer? See, now you have LL bin. Now, adjacent to that, they have given customer order arrives. Because the customer is giving order with LL bin, he receives the order here. So now whatever happens between LL bin and the customer, it happens only after the customer order has been received. So it is based on receiving the order. So whatever happens in the customer order cycle here, it comes under pull process. That is to tell all the transaction happens once after receiving the order. Whereas what happens with the manufacturer and the supplier? Now here all the orders are given beforehand, and especially when it comes for fabrics, it would be given before, almost before 3 to 6 months. So here the order shall be given in anticipation of the demand by considering what might happen in the future. So the procurement, manufacturing and replenishment cycle, they come under push process. Even though on the uncertainty of demand, based on the policies and the procedures, they have given the order. So even before they got the order, that is push process. While whereas between LLB and customer, they have supplied the product only after receiving the order. So in this supply chain, there is pull process and push process. Now we also consider the view of debt. Yes. Now what happens with the debt? Now Dell does not sell through a reseller or distributor. But what does it do? It directly sells to the customer. So demand is not fulfilled from finished product inventory, but it is fulfilled directly from the production. So the arrival of the customer order, that is the point which triggers production of the product. The manufacturer cycle is thus part of customer order fulfillment also. And it is a part of customer order fulfillment process in the customer order cycle. Now, so if we observe clearly the Dell's supply chain, there are effectively only two cycles. Now, as compared to the cyclic view that we saw, here there are only two cycles. First one is a customer order and manufacturing cycle, because once after the company receives the order, it initiates the production. There we have customer order and manufacturing cycle. And the second one is procurement cycle. That is where the company places its procurement order with the supplier. Now, all the processes in the customer order and the manufacturing cycle at Dell can be classified as pull process, because they are initiated by the customer arrival. If customer doesn't arrive, then definitely there is nothing to be executed. So, but however, Dell does not place component orders in response to a customer order. This is also true fact. Yes, I supply the product once after I receive the order. But my placement of order, it happens well before I get my order. That is what Dell, that is how Dell works. So all the process in the procurement cycle for Dell are classified as push process, because they are in response to a forecast, not on the basis of demand but on the basis of forecast. So the process in the Dell supply chain break up into pull and push. How is it broken up? You can see on the right hand side of the slide. So see here, there are only two cycle, that is customer order and manufacturing cycle is one. You have procurement cycle. Now the company receives the customer order cycle, and everything that happens is pull process, because after receiving the order it has started working. Whereas when it has to order, it does it well before in hand. That is why it is push process. Now again the same question. Where do we think this push view or the pull view is useful? So this push view or pull view of the supply chain, it is very useful when we consider strategic decision which are to be made, especially regarding the supply chain design. Now, the main aim is to identify an appropriate push and pull boundary. Or in this process, we have to know where is the push process happening, where is the pull process that is happening. Or in some other words, where is that I have to forecast Where is that I have to wait for the actual order. But why is it necessary that the company comes up with this push or pull boundary? Because because the supply chain can match supply and demand effectively, it is necessary that they differentiate or they come up with the boundaries of supply chain. Okay, now if we speak about this push and pull view, now the paint industry. Now this paint industry, it provides one of the excellent example of the benefits that has been gained from adjusting the push or pull boundary. Okay. Oh, what happened? What happened was the manufacturer of paints requires production of the base, mixing of suitable colors and packing. Yes, now you might have purchased paints to when with the for the construction of your own house, or you might have observed it. Now definitely it requires the base, there shall be a base, and for the base the suitable colors would be mixed and later it was packed. Now, what used to happen? Until 1980s, all these processes were performed in large factories and paint cans were shipped to stores. Okay, this qualified as push process, that is in anticipation, as they were performed to the forecast in anticipation of customer demand. And given the uncertainty of demand, the paint supply chain had great difficulty with matching supply and demand. And in 1990s, paint supply chain was restructured such that mixing of colors was done at retail stores after customer placed their orders. In other words, color mixing was shifted from push to the pull phase of the supply chain. Even though base operation and packing of cans was still performed in the push phase, the mixing was done in the pull phase. So the result is that customers are always able to get the color of their choice, while total paint investors across the supply chain have declined, or the inventories across the supply chain have declined. Now earlier we used to have access only for limited colors. Now they would allow us to see in the computer, and on based on the quantity that have to be mixed to bring that color, they would be mixing it for the base color and would be providing with the paint. So earlier, to match the supply and demand, they used to face huge difficulties, but now it is not the case. Now it has become very easier. So I hope you have understood the concept of both cyclic wave and push or pull wave. Now there is only two, but cyclic wave is different, push or pull. Now push or pull happens together. For this view of process, this view of supply chain, there is both push wave and pull wave. What is push? Push is on the anticipation of demand, we do something. Pull is on the basis of receiving order, we do things. So that is all about push view or pull view. Okay, I hope this is clear and it is easy for you all to understand. Now, now there is one last concept, uh, that is a very very small concept, that is with regard to that of supply chain macro processes in a firm. That is very simple, it would be completed uh, in a span of 5 to 10 minutes. And we shall also see the difference between the value chain and supply chain. These two things we shall do in the next class. Maybe it will take 15 minutes for this, and we shall begin with the second chapter. If I am not wrong, we would be able to finish half of the second chapter in the by this weekend. So, yeah.